At the cutting edge of human advancement, scientific experimentation is taking on ever more incredible forms. Nuclear reactors and particle colliders might as well be antiques. Semiconductors and life-saving medications are produced at an incredible volume worldwide, and there are people in the world who could build a space probe, drill for an ice core, or pilot a deep-sea submersible with their eyes closed. Today, if you try to push the boundaries of human understanding, you might build a quantum computer that can solve in 5 minutes a challenge that would otherwise take, septillions of years. But today, we're going to look at something at the real frontier of human understanding, and that's the deep underground neutrino experiment, otherwise known as Dune. Just watched Dune last weekend. A decades-long initiative bringing together over 1,000 scientific collaborators from all over the world, the Dune experiment is described in the world of particle physics as a project of utmost importance, perhaps the single highest priority of an entire branch of the scientific community. It's a project expected to run for many years once it's complete. It is embattled, it's behind schedule, and it's pushing against the oncoming force of a new competitor. But if it can be completed and put into action, it will explain to all of humanity the very nature of our universe. This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform to build and grow your online presence. Whether you're launching a business, starting a blog, or showcasing your portfolio, Squarespace absolutely have you covered. Their design intelligence uses cutting-edge AI to help you craft a website that feels uniquely yours. Got no design experience? Me neither. It's not a problem. Also, do you need to handle payments? Well, Squarespace Payments simplifies the process with popular options like Apple Pay and Klarna, making it seamless for you and your customers. And if you're looking to connect with your audience, Squarespace's email campaigns let you create automated emails that drive traffic and sales, all from one platform. I've tried it myself, and it's super intuitive and packed with features that make life easier. So, what are you waiting for? Head to squarespace.com/megaprojects for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use the code MEGAPROJECTS to save 10% on your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's video. To understand the work that will take place at the deep underground neutrino experiment, we first got to understand the subatomic particles around which this entire experiment is built. The neutrino. Neutrinos, so-called elementary particles, are one of a few kinds of particle that are not made up of other types of particles, in a way that, say, a proton is actually made up of 3 even tinier quarks. Basically, the most fundamental building blocks of the matter in our universe are really, really, really little, and neutrinos are the littlest of them all. In fact, the mass of a neutrino is so infinitesimally tiny that for most of the time that humanity's known about them, we thought their mass simply just is zero. In fact, one of the most fascinating things about neutrinos is just how negligible they are in just about every way. They're electrically neutral with no charge, and their mass isn't just near zero, it's many, many times smaller than even the next smallest elementary particle. They only interact with gravity, which they barely interact with at all because of how little mass they've got, as well as the weak nuclear force which a neutrino exerts in such a tiny radius that it's unlikely to have any effect on anything. Now, the other thing that you got to understand about neutrinos is that they are absolutely everywhere. Hundreds of billions of them, perhaps trillions of them, just pass through your body every single second, just like they pass through every other bit of our world. In fact, as far as humanity can tell, they're just as abundant everywhere in the universe. It is extremely rare for them to interact with any other forms of matter, so rare that, as physicist Frank Close once described it, and we'll quote him here, one neutrino can fly through a light year of lead without hitting anything. They're emitted by all sorts of radioactive decay, including the fusion reactions that take place at the core of stars like our sun, as well as the fission reactions that humans have learned to create here on Earth. They also come from the interaction between atoms and cosmic rays, and funnily enough, they also come from bananas at really high rates compared to other earthly matter. They're thought to pass through a square centimeter of space at a rate of up to 65 billion per second, counting just the ones from our sun alone, and they're thought to even be able to travel through other dimensions where light, as well as our human awareness, simply cannot reach. Now, that's not where the long list of cool neutrino facts concludes, but in the interest of not breaking either your brains at home or our own brains, they're already a little bit broken, we'll leave it to the true particle physics nerds in the comments to educate anybody who'd like to learn more. We need to move on. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to turn to the question at the heart of the deep underground neutrino experiment. What can neutrinos teach us? To hear worldwide leaders in particle physics explain it, they could teach us that everything we ever thought we knew was wrong, and that's just the start. The trouble with neutrinos is that, according to the Standard Model, humanity's general understanding of what the universe is and how it works, neutrinos just shouldn't have mass, something that they do, at least in the majority of cases. They also shouldn't be able to travel faster than the speed of light, although they might be able to by passing to other dimensions. Now, according to some scientists, they also hold the key to why the universe is made of matter and not either antimatter or just being completely empty. They'll also explain why antimatter particles seem to have disappeared after the Big Bang nearly 14 billion years ago, for some reason other than they're being cancelled out by equal amounts of matter, which also would have winked out of existence. It's become increasingly clear that in the 21st century, to learn about neutrinos is to dig into the greatest secrets of physics. If humanity can get a concrete measurement of their mass, especially the potential different masses of several kinds of neutrinos, then we can fill in a whole lot of missing information about the universe. If we can confirm that they could travel faster than the speed of light, we might start on a path that allows us to interact with dimensions of time and space that we right now just cannot perceive. If we can confirm that the neutrino is the reason that the universe is made of matter, then we can begin to address a range of other fundamental questions that have eluded modern science for so long. And depending on what we find, we might even upend the Standard Model, or be able to greatly refine it at least, to match the realities at play in our universe. We can study supernovas, the core of our own sun, the creation of heavy elements, and so much more, all if we can just find a way to measure and thus to interact with these spooky little particles that hardly interact with anything. And this is where, entering into the picture, we have what was originally called the Long Baseline Neutrino Experiment. First floated around the scientific community back in the early 2010s, the Long Baseline Neutrino Experiment is initially envisioned to be a US-exclusive project to build the neutrino detector. Within a couple of years, though, that vision had morphed and it got a fair bit more support, one that would allow it to call upon, well, the world's best particle physicists in a big, grand initiative. As called for by a panel of particle physicists known as the P5, the right way to go forward was to begin a broad international mission hosted by the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory outside of the US city of Chicago, but also relying on scientists, contributors, and support from all around the world. In the early days of 2015, a decade ago now, it was made official. The world's best minds were going to begin a decades-long endeavor to understand the neutrino and to build Dune to make that happen. To say that Dune will be constructed at a single location is to misunderstand the very nature of the experiment that's going to go on there. Instead, Dune is going to be built at 2 points within the northern continental United States, separated by a distance of some 1,300 kilometers, that's 800 miles. The first location in question, the sending location, so to speak, is at Fermilab in the Chicago suburbs, where a particle accelerator will be responsible for generating incredible amounts of neutrinos and sending them in a focused beam that points westward. At a distance of one very long day's drive, that focused beam will hit a receiver located at the Stanford University Research Center, or SURF, the deepest underground laboratory in the United States. Now, that distance between the sending accelerator and the receiving detector apparatus is extremely important. The thing that Dune really wants to observe is something called neutrino oscillation. This is a quantum mechanical phenomenon that we've held off on describing so far. We don't need to get into too much of the hard science to gain a working understanding of the basics, so we're not going to do that. Although, if you're interested in what we describe and want to know more, there is definitely more out there to learn, probably several degrees worth. But basically, look, neutrinos, they can be observed in one of three known states, and these are referred to in the particle physics world as flavors. But as they travel across distances that could be very short on an astrophysical scale, but are relatively far apart on a human scale, a single neutrino can change or oscillate between flavors. Now, there's a good deal of scientific evidence to support that these oscillations take place. But, much like the concepts of matter and antimatter, neutrinos also have a binary opposite, and that, of course, is antineutrinos. Now, antineutrinos, they oscillate as well, but they do so more slowly than regular neutrinos, possibly explaining why neutrinos and antineutrinos decay at different rates. It's the changes in both of them, the oscillations of neutrinos and antineutrinos, that Dune is really trying to measure. And to do that, Dune needs to leverage some seriously impressive engineering. At the sending location at Fermilab, the particle accelerator responsible for generating this cascade of neutrinos will first create a beam of protons at a strength of about 2.4 megawatts. Those protons will then be degraded into two types of subatomic particle known as pions and kaons. Those pions and kaons will then be magnetically focused into something called a decay pipe, where they'll further degrade into the particles that scientists are really after, those little neutrinos. As they go, they'll be observed by another apparatus on the Fermilab site known as the Dune Near Detector. This is situated about 600 meters, or about 2,000 feet away from the point where neutrinos are produced, and the near detector is going to be made up of several individual subdetectors installed at both fixed and movable points around the neutrino beam in order to gather information about what that beam is emitting. The near detector's job is to collect data on how many neutrinos and antineutrinos are being created and in what flavors, so that all of that data can be beamed to South Dakota and cross-referenced against what's being observed at that location. Okay, so if you remember from a moment ago, we've explained that neutrinos only interact with things in their path extremely rarely. That's the idea from the expert we quoted earlier of neutrinos moving through a light year of solid lead. As a result, this incredibly dense beam of neutrinos should have no trouble, say, moving through the Earth's crust, and, well, that's precisely what it does once it leaves Fermilab. Partially to keep as stable and neutral an environment as possible for the neutrinos to pass through, and partially because trying to make a straight-shot beam between Chicago and rural South Dakota is actually a lot harder than it sounds. The neutrino beam passes through solid rock for hundreds of miles before eventually reaching its target. Across that distance, the rate of neutrino and antineutrino oscillation should be high enough that there will be an observable change in the particles sent from Fermilab to the ones received in South Dakota. And receiving the particles, that is perhaps the most impressive piece of engineering in this whole setup, and that would be the Dune bar detector, a so-called liquid argon time projection chamber. Now, this detector is going to leverage some 70 metric kilotons of liquid argon. That's about 154 million pounds of the stuff that's divided into 4 modules. And that argon is going to be buried very deep in the mine shafts that South Dakota's underground research facility is based around, at a depth of around 1.5 kilometers, or nearly 5,000 feet under the surface of the Earth above. Those detectors are going to be housed in massive caverns, requiring the excavation of about 725,000 metric tons of rock. That's 800,000 short tons using the convention of the US. You're welcome. Now, those caverns were finally fully excavated in early last year, 2024, spanning a surface area about the size of 8 football fields, or soccer, again, for our friends in the US, not American football. We don't use those units. Each cavern is then going to house one of the 4 neutrino detector modules, itself about the size of a 7-story building. Their job is to basically sit there, underground, and to just be bombarded continuously by that beam of neutrinos, with the understanding that occasionally a neutrino or an antineutrino is going to interact with the liquid argon and produce measurable signals that will help determine its mass and thus its flavor. Specialized microelectronics embedded within the ultra-cold liquid argon will convert neutrino interaction signals to digitally transmissible data before being sent back to the operators of the apparatus without issue. Once that data is received, it's going to be incorporated to 3D modeling software that reconstructs electrical activity that the neutrino interactions generate, giving scientists a clear view of each interaction as it happens. And although we're talking about a rare occurrence, when we discuss a neutrino banging into an atom, they're also talking about a rare occurrence within some truly mind-boggling sets of numbers. In just 1 pound of liquid argon, there's about 15 septillion individual atoms. That's a 1, a 5, and then 24 zeros. Multiply that by the amount of argon in the far detector apparatus, and that's about 2.3 decillion atoms that are there to interact with the beam of neutrinos. That's a 2, then a 3, and then 32 more zeros after that. Those atoms are going to be tightly packed in argon's extremely dense liquid form, thus raising the likelihood even further that a neutrino will collide with them. And under the focused intensity of this particular neutrino beam, every square centimeter of surface area of those liquid argon molecules will be bombarded with tens of billions of neutrinos or more every single second. These are numbers that are well past the point of being comprehensible to the human mind, and that is the point. Try and create a rarely occurring particle interaction while leveraging that many individual atoms and neutrinos to try and produce such an interaction, and something that's numerically rare might take place nearly constantly from a human perspective. Now, Dune's not expected to fire up its neutrino beam for active research until the early 2030s, and unfortunately the project has suffered a range of setbacks before even getting to the status that it's at now, which is not ready at all. The first 2 far detector modules were initially expected to be operational in 2024, and the neutrino beam in 2026 at a cost of between 1.26 and 1.86 billion US dollars. Today, the project is badly behind schedule and substantially over budget, despite large contributions from a range of world nations. The project is currently intended to be completed in 2 phases, with Phase 1 consisting of 2 far detectors, a scaled-back near detector, and a neutrino beam of a strength currently projected at 1.2 megawatts, stated to be operational in 2032. The price tag for that first phase alone will be over $3 billion US dollars, a figure that's been established while this project is still almost a decade out from even that completion date. Phase 2 is expected to cost close to $1 billion at a minimum in order to round out the project. Now, among the issues at hand are ballooning costs around constructing the South Dakota receiver apparatus, demands from the US Department of Energy to add sub-projects and devices, and disagreements between the particle physics community and the people who fund the research community over plans to create a multi-phase process rather than pushing forward with the original plan. Although the project's architects certainly hope to avoid future delays, their success in doing so is far from assured, and some of the program's critics suggest that it won't be operational till the 2040s, assuming that it can avoid cancellation. But if Dune does go operational, then the study of flavor-changing neutrinos and antineutrinos will give modern science its clearest indicator yet on whether physicists are right to be following the standard model as it's laid out. The really valuable indicator thereafter isn't simply the confirmation that these particles will sometimes change their flavor between Chicago and South Dakota, but the difference in change rates between neutrinos and antineutrinos. If neutrinos change more rapidly than antineutrinos, then it's generally a step in the right direction, indicating that neutrino decay does indeed help to explain why the universe is made up of so much matter with comparatively scarce antimatter. But there's no guarantee of what Dune will actually show. And if it shows a difference that's smaller than expected, or no difference at all, then it'll be a revelation that breaks apart everything we thought we knew about the reasons behind the universe's composition. Not only that, but the firing of the neutrino beam might lead to other revelations about the neutrino's extra-dimensional nature. If neutrinos travel at expected speeds, then they'll take about 4 milliseconds to get from Fermilab to the underground receiver. If they get there faster, however, then the observations made by Dune may reveal more about what happens to neutrinos as they seem to travel faster than they should. As time goes on, and Dune's operators check research objectives off their list, they'll almost certainly find new ways to use it, gathering greater and greater knowledge on a particle that we hardly understand today. In fact, Dune has already led to major breakthroughs in particle physics even before it's become operational. Perhaps the greatest breakthrough so far is precisely the one you might expect: humanity's very first direct detection of a neutrino made by a particle accelerator. That discovery was announced in August of 2024 by Fermilab scientists to use a liquid argon detector prototype many times smaller than the eventual Dune reactor will be. With that single instance of detection picking up on at least a single one of what would have been trillions and trillions of neutrinos passing through the prototype, Fermilab was able to provide major validation to their entire research project. Detect one neutrino using a particle accelerator to create it and the argon module's measurement instruments to observe it, and the eventual Dune design will be able to monitor near simultaneous interactions once it becomes operational. But whatever the Dune apparatus does in the future, It'll do either as a first-place finisher in the race to understand the neutrino, or as a dismal and very expensive runner-up. At this very moment, Dune is locked into a contest with an apparatus called Hyper-K, under construction via the University of Tokyo and the High Energy Accelerator Research Organization. The Hyper-K neutrino beam travels a far shorter distance than Dune, at just 295 kilometers, 183 miles, making it likely to observe a lower rate of neutrino oscillations than Dune will. It's got a significantly larger detector, however, and the closer proximity of the Hyper-K receiver to its sending beam will make up for its lower rate of oscillation with a far higher rate of interaction, while the neutrino beam is still relatively strong. The Hyper-K apparatus is on schedule, it's on budget, and it's rolling in international contributions, and it's currently a full 5 years ahead of schedule relative to Dune. It's slated to end construction in 2027. At present, optimistic assessments of the two programs suggest that Dune will be significantly behind Hyper-K in generating major results around neutrino oscillation, and Dune's proponents have largely stopped suggesting that it can still rally back to beat Hyper-K if its scheduling and delay issues were to be fixed. They just haven't been. Both projects are also trying to beat a Chinese neutrino experiment known as Juno and stay ahead of several planned experiments that will take place atmospherically in the next few years. The Deep Underground Neutrino experiment is exceptionally impressive. It's an incredible piece of engineering. It's got the potential to bring fundamental answers to questions that have stumped scientists for decades, and it is truly unlike any mechanism currently in operation around the world. But the difficult reality is that at the same time as all that may be true, the Dune apparatus is struggling. It's limping to the finish line with little hope of still placing first, and it may not even be able to replicate some of the scientific feats performed by Hyper-K, Juno, and other experiments of this type. In some ways, the most important question facing down Dune's architects and its advocates is whether to pull the plug. But how can they? After billions sunk into the project, after a decade and more gathering the hopes and ambitions of the scientific community, how can Fermilab and its many collaborators simply just walk away? Headed into the back half of the 2020s, it'll be that question that Dune and its developers must answer first, before any questions of particle interaction or the foundation of our universe can ever be addressed in kind. Answer the first of those questions, and Dune may survive to tackle the second. But there are no guarantees that this marvel of modern science won't end up just like the neutrinos it was supposed to study. Disappeared into the void, as if it had never been there at all.